There are certain stories that Hollywood tells about itself, passed from set to set, from green room to green room, from one generation of actors to the next, that feel almost too cinematic to have actually happened, and yet too specific, too textured, too consistent with the personalities involved, to dismiss outright as pure invention. This is one of those stories. It involves two of the most recognizable men of 20th century American entertainment, a horse that nobody trusted, and a wager that has been retold so many times, in so many slightly different versions, that separating the truth from the legend requires more patience than most retellings are willing to give it. Tonight, we're going to give it that patience. We're going to walk through what is documented, what is rumored, what is plausible, and what has simply been repeated so often that it is calcified into something that sounds like history, whether or not it actually is. Before we get to the bed itself, it helps to understand the world these two men were moving through, because the story only makes sense once you understand the personas they had built. Personas so powerful that an off-screen anecdote about either of them would naturally bend to fit the legend already in place. John Wayne, by the time most versions of the story are said to have taken place, was not simply a working actor. He had become something closer to a national symbol, a man whose face had been so thoroughly fused with the idea of the American West that audiences had stopped distinguishing between performer and the role. Through Stagecoach in 1939, through Red River, through The Searchers, through Rio Bravo, he had built a screen identity defined by quiet authority, physical confidence, an unshakable sense that he belonged on a horse more naturally than most men belong behind a desk. This was not an accident of casting. Wayne had spent years cultivating that image, working with stunt coordinators, learning to handle horses convincingly, studying particular swagger that would become instantly recognizable even in silhouette. By the 1950s and into the 1960s, the idea of John Wayne had become inseparable from rugged, unpretentious American masculinity, and he seemed to understand the value of maintaining that image even when the cameras stopped rolling. That off-screen maintenance is part of what makes the wager stories so believable to people who study old Hollywood. Multiple biographers, co-stars, and crew members who worked with Wayne over the decades have described him in interviews and memoirs as a man who enjoyed testing people. Sometimes through poker, sometimes through arm wrestling, sometimes through elaborate practical jokes that could stretch across an entire shoot. He was known to needle people he liked, to challenge them in small physical ways that had nothing to do with malice, and everything to do with a kind of theatrical machismo that he seemed to enjoy performing even in private company. If you spend any time reading first-hand accounts from people on his film sets, you start to notice a pattern. Wayne liked stakes. He liked turning ordinary moments into contests. He liked being the one who set the terms of a challenge. And he liked watching how people responded when they were put on the spot. None of this proves that the specific wager in this story took place, but it does help explain why. When the story is told, almost nobody who has studied Wayne's life finds it implausible on its face. It fits a documented pattern of behavior, even if the specific event remains undocumented. Dean Martin occupied an entirely different lane in the same Hollywood universe, and that contrast is precisely what gives this story its dramatic charge. Martin had built an entire career around effortlessness. He was the smooth half of Martin and Lewis before that partnership dissolved, the velvet-voiced crooner who could glide through a ballad and then turn around and deliver a perfectly timed joke without breaking his rhythm. As a member of the loosely defined Rat Pack, alongside Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, and Joey Bishop, Martin became one of the most visible embodiments of a certain kind of Las Vegas cool, tuxedoed, drink in hand, unbothered by anything, performing a persona of relaxed indifference so convincingly that audiences sometimes forgot it was a persona at all. This is the image most people carry of Dean Martin. Smooth, soft, urbane, a man who belonged on a stage under colored lights, not on the back of an unbroken horse in the dust of some ranch. But here is where the story gets its real tension, and where there is at least some documented basis for the surprise the legend describes. Dean Martin's early life was considerably rougher than his stage persona ever advertised. Born Dino Paul Crocetti in Steubenville, Ohio, to immigrant parents, Martin grew up in a working-class environment shaped by physical labor and, by several accounts, genuine hardship. As a teenager, he reportedly worked in a steel mill, worked as a craps dealer, and, this is a detail most relevant to our story, boxed as an amateur under the name Kid Crochet. Boxing, even briefly, even as a teenager scraping together whatever income he could find, requires a level of physical toughness and risk tolerance that doesn't simply vanish once a person trades it for a recording contract and a tailored suit. Several biographical accounts of Martin's life have noted that this rougher, tougher younger version of himself never fully disappeared. It was simply buried beneath the smooth nightclub act that made him famous. People who worked closely with him reportedly noted that underneath the relaxed exterior was someone with more physical confidence and resilience than his on-stage image suggested. So when a legend says that John Wayne, the embodiment of rugged American masculinity, underestimated Dean Martin, the smooth entertainer, and was surprised by how well Martin handled himself on a wild horse, the story isn't simply a fun twist invented out of nowhere. It plays directly into something that does appear to have at least some grounding in Martin's actual biography, a tougher, more physically capable man hiding behind an image of total ease. Now, let's talk about how this story is usually told, because the way a legend gets told often reveals as much about its reliability as the content of the legend itself. In most versions that circulate online, in clip compilations, in articles built for a quick consumption, the story goes roughly like this. John Wayne and Dean Martin, already friendly to the overlapping social world of mid-century Hollywood, a world where actors, singers, directors, and producers all seem to know each other, drink with each other, work with each other across different studios and different projects, find themselves around horses. Some versions place this near a film set, suggesting it happened during production where horses were already present for filming purposes. Other versions place it more vaguely on a ranch, without specifying whose ranch or when or under what circumstances the two men ended up there together. This vagueness is itself a clue. A story passed down through verified historical channels tends to accumulate specific, checkable details over time, dates, locations, named witnesses. A story passed down through oral tradition tends to do the opposite. The details get vaguer the more times it gets retold, because each new teller fills in gaps with whatever feels narratively satisfying rather than what can actually be confirmed. According to the legend, Wayne, looking at Martin in whatever context they found themselves in, decided that the lounge singer had no business attempting to ride a horse that had a reputation for throwing off anyone who tried. Some versions describe the horse as untamed or wild in the most literal sense, an animal that had not been broken for riding at all. Other versions soften this slightly, describing merely a particularly spirited or difficult horse that required real skill to control. Wayne, never a man to let a perceived mismatch go unexploited, supposedly proposed a bet. Some retellings frame this as a wager involving money, a specific dollar amount that varies depending on who's telling the story, which again should raise a small flag for anyone trying to track this down as documented history. Other retellings suggest the stakes were less about money and more about pride, the kind of bet too famous. Competitive men might make in front of friends or crew members specifically because the social cost of backing down would be higher than any embarrassment from losing the bet itself. And then, in nearly every version of the story, Martin gets on the horse. This is the moment the story exists for. This is a dramatic hinge the entire anecdote is built around, and it's worth pausing here to really sit with what the legend is asking us to imagine. Picture the scene as it's usually described. A group of people standing around, maybe laughing, maybe skeptical, watching as a man known for his tuxedos and his microphone and his easy Vegas charm approaches an animal that, by every outward expectation, should have no patience for him. Wayne, according to the legend, watches with the kind of confident amusement of a man who has already mentally collected his winnings. The horse, unpredictable, tense, exactly the kind of animal that has thrown far more experienced riders. And Martin, smooth, soft-looking, seemingly built for cocktail lounges rather than corrals, swings up into the saddle. What happens next, according to the popular version of this legend, is the part that has made the story durable enough to survive decades of retelling. Martin, against every expectation in the room, handles the horse. Not perfectly, necessarily. Some versions allow for a rough ride, a few tense moments, an animal that bucks and resists before eventually settling, but well enough, controlled enough, confident enough that it becomes clear almost immediately that this was not the mismatch everyone assumed it would be. The legend says Wayne, the man who had built an entire career on embodying cowboy competence, found himself genuinely surprised. maybe even a little outmaneuvered, the wager, which he had set up as an easy win, turns into something closer to a lesson in not judging people by their stage persona. It's an enormously satisfying story to tell, and that satisfaction is exactly what should make us pause before accepting it as settled history. Here's the problem. Stated plainly, there is no widely available, independently verifiable primary source that nails this story down. There is no contemporaneous news report from the era describing this specific event. There is no on-the-record interview, as far as exists in the accessible historical record, in which either John Wayne or Dean Martin describes this particular bet, this particular horse, this particular afternoon, in their own words, with specific details that could be cross-checked against other accounts. What we have instead is something much more common in the world of Hollywood storytelling, an oral tradition, a story that seems to have circulated among people who worked in or around the industry, repeated in interviews given by other actors or crew members decades after the fact, picked up by entertainment writers building retrospective pieces, and eventually distilled into the kind of clean, dramatic narrative you'd expect to find in a video essay or a magazine listicle about Hollywood's wildest bets. This doesn't mean the story is fabricated from nothing. Oral history has real value, even when it can't be perfectly verified. People who actually worked alongside Wayne and Martin may well have witnessed something resembling this event and describe it to others, who then pass it along with whatever details they could remember, filling gaps with reasonable assumptions along the way. That's how most behind-the-scenes Hollywood stories survive. Very few of them come with documentary evidence. Most of them come with second-hand or third-hand testimony, told and retold at industry parties, in green rooms, in interviews where an aging actor is asked to share a memory and reaches for whichever story has aged best in their memory, regardless of how precisely accurate it remains. So what can we actually say with confidence, and what has to remain in the category of legend? We can say with confidence that John Wayne and Dean Martin existed within the same social and professional ecosystem. Hollywood in the 1950s and 1960s was, despite its size, a remarkably interconnected world, especially among its biggest stars. Actors moved between studios, attended the same parties, golfed together, drank together, occasionally worked together on films, and developed friendships and rivalries that crossed genre lines in ways that might surprise people who only think of Wayne as a Western icon and Martin as a music and comedy performer. Wayne and Martin did appear together in film projects over the years, and the broader social world of mid-century Hollywood absolutely included the kind of informal gatherings, at ranches, at private parties, at industry events, where a story like this could plausibly have originated. So the setting is plausible. The social proximity required for two men like this to end up around horses together is plausible. None of that proves a specific bet happened. But it does mean the premise isn't asking us to imagine two strangers who never crossed paths. We can also say with confidence that Wayne had a documented reputation, described by multiple people who work with him, for enjoying wagers and physical challenges as a form of social interaction. This is corroborated across enough independent sources, co-stars, directors, crew members who gave interviews across different decades, that it represents something close to a consistent pattern rather than a single unverifiable claim. Wayne liked stakes. He liked testing people. He liked turning ordinary social moments into contests with winners and losers. That pattern doesn't prove the specific story, but it does mean the story is consistent with the kind of man multiple independent witnesses described him as being. And we can say with confidence that Dean Martin's biography includes real physical toughness that existed well before his career as a smooth entertainer. The steel mill work, the boxing, the working-class Ohio upbringing that shaped him long before Las Vegas ever knew his name. This means a surprise at the center of the legend, the idea that the tuxedoed crooner had more grit than anyone expected, isn't simply a clever narrative invention. It reflects something that does appear to be true about who Martin actually was underneath the persona he performed on stage. What we cannot say with confidence is that the specific bet on the specific horse, with a specific outcome described in most retellings, is a verified historical event with a clear date, location, and set of witnesses whose accounts can be cross-checked. As far as the accessible historical record shows, this remains, at best, an oral tradition passed down through Hollywood storytelling, and at worst, a flattering anecdote that may have been embellished, conflated with other stories, or partially invented somewhere along the chain of retellings, then smoothed into something that sounds definitive simply because it has been repeated so many times. This is actually a really common pattern in celebrity folklore, and it's worth taking a moment to talk about why these kind of stories survive and spread the way they do, because understanding that mechanism helps explain why this particular legend has had such staying power. Stories like this tend to endure for a few specific reasons. First, they're psychologically satisfying. They take two well-known public personas and create a moment of friction between them that resolves in a way that subverts audience expectations. We expect a rugged cowboy actor to dominate the situation. Instead, the smooth singer surprises everyone. That subversion is inherently more interesting to tell and retell than a story where expectations are simply confirmed. Nobody tells a long, dramatic story about the cowboy actor easily outrode the singer exactly as everyone expected. The drama lives in surprise, and stories built around a satisfying surprise have an evolutionary advantage in oral tradition. They get repeated more often by more people, because they're simply more fun to share. Second, these stories tend to endure because they offer audiences a glimpse, real or imagined, into the true character of beloved public figures. Part of the enduring fascination with old Hollywood is the sense that beneath the constructed studio personas, there were real people with real personalities, real rivalries, real friendships, real unscripted moments that the public never got to see. A story like this lets audiences imagine they're getting access to that hidden, unscripted layer. Wayne and Martin not as characters in a movie, but as actual men competing, joking, testing each other in ways that feel more real than anything captured on film. Whether or not the specific story is accurate, the appetite for this kind of access is part of why it has survived. Third, and this is worth being honest about, these stories survive because retelling them requires no fact-checking infrastructure. Unlike a contested historical event involving political figures, where journalists and historians have strong incentives to verify or debunk specific claims, a charming off-screen Hollywood anecdote about two beloved entertainers rarely gets subjected to the same level of scrutiny. Nobody loses anything by repeating it. Nobody gains anything obvious by debunking it. It simply circulates, gathering small embellishments with each retelling, until it arrives in front of you looking complete and authoritative, even though its actual evidentiary foundation may be thinner than its confident tone suggests. It's worth comparing this story, briefly, to other similar legends in the same era, because old Hollywood is absolutely full of these kinds of anecdotes. Stories about wagers, dares, physical contests between famous men that supposedly took place off camera, often at parties, on ranches, or on film sets between takes. Some of these stories have at least partial documentation. A co-star mentions in a memoir, a director references it in an interview, a contemporaneous gossip column makes a brief mention that can be cross-checked against other sources. Others exist purely as oral tradition, repeated in retrospective documentaries and clip compilations decades after the fact, with no contemporaneous source ever surfacing. The Wayne Martin horse bet, as far as available research shows, falls much closer to the second category. It's the kind of story that gets told in documentaries like this one, because it's a great story, while honest narrators have to acknowledge that great story and verified history are not the same category, even when they overlap. Let's also consider the practical realities of horses riding in Hollywood culture in this era, because that context helps us evaluate how plausible the central scenario actually is, independent of whether we can verify it happened. By the 1950s and 1960s, horses were an enormous part of the entertainment industry, particularly for anyone involved in westerns, which were dominating American film and television at the time. Studios maintained relationships with ranches and stables that supplied horses for productions. Actors who worked frequently in westerns, Wayne chief among them, developed genuine riding skill over the course of their careers, not just for the camera, but because spending that much time around horses naturally builds real competence. It would not have been unusual for a major western star like Wayne to have access to horses, to ranches, to the kind of informal social gathering where a wild or difficult horse might be present and might become the subject of a dare. This lends some real-world plausibility to the setting of the story, even without confirming the specific event. At the same time, it's worth being skeptical about the word wild as it's used in most retellings. Horses used in film production, even ones with reputations for being difficult or spirited, were generally not literally wild, untamed animals in the sense of having never been broken for riding at all. Truly wild horses would be exceptionally dangerous and impractical to have around a film set or a working ranch frequented by actors and crew. It's far more likely, if there's any factual core to the story at all, that the horse in question was simply spirited, difficult, or had a reputation for throwing inexperienced riders. Still a real test of skill, still potentially dangerous, but a different proposition than an actual unbroken wild Mustang. This is a small but important distinction, and it's the kind of detail that tends to get exaggerated in retelling specifically because wild horse makes for a more dramatic story than a horse that was known for being difficult to handle. So when we ask what likely happened, if anything happened at all, the most reasonable version probably looks less cinematic than the legend suggests. Perhaps there was a horse with a reputation for being hard to ride. Perhaps Wayne, in his well-documented habit of needling friends and testing people, made some kind of comment suggesting Martin wouldn't be able to handle it. Perhaps Martin, drawing on instincts and confidence built during a rougher youth that few people associate with a stage persona, got on a horse and handled it better than expected, creating a small, memorable moment among the people present. That smaller, more modest version of events is consistent with everything we actually know about both men's documented personalities, and it doesn't require us to invent a dramatic, fully realized scene with a formal wager, an audience, and a clean dramatic arc. It's entirely possible that the version we hear today is simply an embellished descendant of something much more low-key that actually occurred, polished over decades of retelling into the version that now circulates as a complete anecdote. It's also entirely possible that even this more modest version isn't accurate, and that the story is, at its core, an invented anecdote that simply felt so true to both men's public personas that nobody ever felt compelled to push back on it. This happens more often in celebrity culture than people tend to assume. A story gets told once, perhaps by someone with a loose connection to either man, perhaps as something they heard secondhand, and because it fits so neatly into the existing mythology of both figures, it gets repeated without anyone checking whether it actually happened. Eventually it gets told by someone with a platform, a talk show host, a biographer, a documentary narrator, and from that point forward it exists in the public record as something that everyone knows, even though its origin remains untraceable. This is, frankly, one of the more interesting things about Hollywood mythology as a broader phenomenon. The industry is built on image making. Every actor who reaches a level of fame that Wayne and Martin reached is, in a very real sense, a product of careful image construction, wardrobes, scripts, publicity teams, carefully managed interviews, all designed to create a consistent, marketable persona. But audiences have always been hungry for something underneath that constructed image, some sense of the real person behind the performance. Off-screen anecdotes like this one serve that hunger directly. They promise access to something unscripted, unguarded, more authentic than anything captured on film. And because that hunger is so persistent, stories that satisfy it tend to spread and survive regardless of how well they hold up to scrutiny, simply because the alternative, accepting that we may never really know what these men were like behind closed doors, is far less satisfying. There's a particular irony worth sitting with here, too. John Wayne spent an entire career building a screen persona around being exactly the kind of man who could handle a difficult horse without hesitation. That was, in a sense, his job, convincing audiences that he embodied a kind of rugged American competence that very few real people, including many actual cowboys, ever fully possessed. Dean Martin spent his career building the opposite kind of persona, convincing audiences that he was smooth, relaxed, more comfortable holding a cocktail than a set of reins. The legend of this bet works precisely because it imagines a moment where those two carefully constructed personas collide, and where the constructed image, for once, fails to predict the outcome. It's a story about the gap between performance and reality, told about two men whose entire careers were built on performance. That thematic resonance is in some ways more interesting than the literal question of whether the bet happened, because it tells us something true about how audiences relate to celebrity image, even if it can't tell us something verifiably true about one specific afternoon decades ago. Let's also consider, briefly, the role that storytellers themselves play in keeping legends like this alive, because the chain of transmission matters as much as the content of the story. Many Hollywood anecdotes from this era survive specifically because they get told and retold on television, talk show appearances where aging stars are invited to share behind-the-scenes memories, retrospective documentaries built around clip compilations and interview footage, biographical specials produced after a star's death that rely heavily on the recollections of friends, co-stars, and family members. These formats are incredibly valuable for preserving cultural memory, but they're not subjected to the same evidentiary standards as, say, investigative journalism or academic history. A story told by a charming guest on a late-night show, framed as, "I remember the time Wayne and Dean," doesn't need a citation. It needs comedic timing and a willing audience. And once that story has been told on television, even once, it becomes part of the searchable record, repeated in articles and clip compilations for decades afterward, gaining a kind of borrowed authority simply through repetition rather than through verification. This is precisely the environment in which a story like the Wayne Martin horse bet most likely took shape, assuming it has any roots in an actual event at all. Someone who knew one or both men, or who simply heard about the incident from someone who claimed to know one or both men, told the story at some point in some format, and it resonated enough to be repeated. Each subsequent telling added a bit more drama, a bit more specificity, a slightly more satisfying arc, until the version that exists today, the formal wager, the dramatic stakes, the clean narrative of expectation subverted, emerged as a standard version, even though no single verifiable source can be pointed to as its definitive origin. None of this is meant to dismiss the story entirely, and it's worth being clear about that. The goal here isn't to debunk a piece of Hollywood folklore for the sake of debunking it. It's to be honest about what we actually know versus what we're choosing to believe, because it makes a good story. Both things can be true at once. This can be a story worth telling, worth examining, worth including in a documentary like this one, while also being a story we cannot confidently label as verified history. That distinction matters, especially in an era where so much online content blurs the line between this happened and this is a fun story people tell, presenting the second as if it were the first simply because it generates more engagement that way. So let's return one more time to the heart of the question. Why does this particular legend matter? Even without verification, why has it survived as long as it has? And why does it continue to circulate in documentaries, articles, and conversations about old Hollywood? Part of the answer, as we've discussed, is a satisfying subversion of expectations. The rugged cowboy underestimating the smooth singer, only to be surprised. Part of the answer is a genuine biographical plausibility on both sides. Wayne's documented love of wagers and physical challenges, Martin's lesser-known background in physical labor and amateur boxing. But part of the answer, too, is simply that both men remain genuinely beloved figures in American popular culture, and stories about beloved figures tend to accumulate mythology the way a hull accumulates barnacles, slowly, persistently, in ways that become difficult to scrape away even when you know, intellectually, that not all it reflects the actual ship underneath. John Wayne's legacy, decades after his death, remains tied to an idea of American identity that continues to be discussed, celebrated, and occasionally critiqued, but rarely ignored. Dean Martin's legacy, similarly, remains tied to a specific kind of mid-century cool that continues to influence how popular culture imagines effortless charisma. Stories that connect these two men, that imagine them interacting in unscripted, human ways, satisfy a continuing public fascination with the idea that the giant of old Hollywood were not simply performances, but real people who joke with each other, competed with each other, surprised each other, just as anyone might. Whether or not the specific story reflects a real Tuesday afternoon on some real ranch in some real year, it reflects something audiences have wanted to believe about both men for a very long time, and that desire alone has been enough to keep the story circulating for decades. If you made it this far hoping for a definitive answer, did it happen, exactly as the title promised? Did Dean Martin really climb onto a wild horse and silence John Wayne's doubts in front of a crowd of stunned onlookers? The honest answer is that the historical record, as far as it can be accessed and verified, does not provide that certainty. What it provides instead is context, a plausible setting, two well-documented personalities whose real biographies make the shape of this story believable, even if its specific details remain unconfirmed. A pattern of Hollywood storytelling that explains why anecdotes like this one spread and survive regardless of their evidentiary foundation, and a thematic resonance, the gap between constructed image and hidden reality, that makes the story worth telling even in the absence of a verified primary source. Maybe that ambiguity is, in its own way, the most honest ending this story can have. Not a triumphant reveal of confirmed fact, but an invitation to sit with uncertainty, to appreciate the texture of a good story without mistaking that texture for proof. John Wayne and Dean Martin both built careers convincing audiences of things that weren't entirely true. That Wayne was simply a cowboy who wandered onto a film set. That Martin was simply a man who never had to try particularly hard at anything. Both personas were performances, polished and maintained over decades, and both men were, underneath those performances, more complicated than the image suggested. Perhaps it's fitting, then, that one of the most enduring stories about them is itself a kind of performance. A story shaped less by verified fact than by decades of retelling, polished into something that feels true, because it fits so well with everything else we think we know. We may never know exactly what happened on that ranch. If anything happened there at all, we may never know whether Dean Martin really did surprise John Wayne, or whether surprise belongs entirely to the storytellers who came after, shaping a moment into the legend we know today. What we do know is that the story has outlived any single verifiable account of it, surviving instead on the strength of its characters, its setting, and its irresistible reversal of expectation. And in an industry built almost entirely on the power of a good story to outlast the literal truth behind it, perhaps that's exactly the kind of legacy John Wayne and Dean Martin, two men who spent their entire careers turning persona into legend, would have appreciated most.